Hello again. Hopefully you're all fired up for chemistry now because we're going to continue on and now talk about what molecules are. All right. So last video lecture we reviewed what atoms are and how those are the fundamental units, the smallest, tiniest particles of particular elements that we have out there in the universe. And we talked about which of those elements you would typically find the most abundantly in our human bodies. Pretty much those elements are the same across all living things. You're not going to see dramatic differences in terms of what our bodies are composed of versus a plant versus a bacterium and so forth and so on, believe it or not. All right, generally though, most atoms are not just floating around out there in the world as individual single atoms. They are usually bonded with other atoms. They combine chemically with other atoms to make molecules. All right, so a molecule is just nothing more than two or more atoms bonded together. Now, if you take a chemistry class, you're going to get into a lot more details than what we're going to cover as far as how those atoms bond with each other. For the most part, in this class and in most biology classes, you can just kind of think about, all right, if you see something like H2, that means you have two hydrogen atoms bonded together. That's really all that means. And then if you see something like this, C6H12O6, that's a chemical formula which tells you you're referring to a molecule that has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens, and they're all bonded together in a particular pattern. And incidentally, that is the chemical formula for glucose. Glucose is a type of sugar molecule. Now, there are many different types of sugars. Glucose is the most famous one that we hear the most about because glucose is the preferred energy source for not just our cells, but essentially every cell loves glucose for energy, or almost every cell does. Almost every living thing loves glucose. Let's see. Hang on just a second. All right, so I just mentioned that molecules consist of atoms bonded together. And so how are these atoms bonded together? There are 3 types of chemical bonds: ionic, covalent, and hydrogen bonds. And so we'll talk a little bit about each of these different types of bonds and what's different about them. First one we're going to talk about are the ionic bonds. And ionic bonds are formed between ions. All right, so what is an ion? Ions are formed by transfer of valence shell electrons between atoms. You know what? Forget valence shell. I should have deleted that. We're not going to get into valence shells in this class. If you've had chemistry, you've heard about it, but we're not going to get into it in this class. All right, so when we did the lecture on atoms and molecules, I mentioned in the nucleus of an atom, you have protons and neutrons, and then surrounding the nucleus, you have electrons, E, orbiting the nucleus. And remember we said electrons have negative charges. And so if you had an atom with 2 electrons orbiting the nucleus, in order for that atom to be neutral, you want the charges to cancel out. So how many protons are you going to have? Protons have positive charges. So within the nucleus over here, you would have 2 protons. Each of those would have a positive charge. That would give you a neutral atom. All right, but let's say this atom loses an electron. Now what do we have? You have 2 positive charges in the nucleus, and you have 1 electron. So you got 2 positives and 1 negative. What's your overall charge going to be? You're going to have kind of a net charge of 1 positive charge. So in that scenario, if an atom loses one electron over what it normally has, it's going to wind up with a single positive charge, and it would be called a positively charged ion. Okay, let me erase all that. Now let's look at a different scenario. Suppose we had a nucleus over here with two positive charges. And we got two neutrons over there as well in our nucleus. And then out here, orbiting the nucleus, we've got two electrons. All right, that's a neutral atom. You got two positives, two negatives, they cancel each other out. Now suppose this atom acquires an additional electron. Now what does it have? It has three electrons and two protons. So overall you got three minuses and two pluses, so you have one extra electron. So in this case you've got an atom that has an overall single negative charge. All right. So if we look at our definitions here, those are both cases where you have ions. Ions have a charge because they have lost or gained one or more electrons. All right, and negatively charged ions can also be called anions. You guys will see that term used from time to time. Positively charged ions can also be called cations. All right, and again, how do you get a negative charge? Because you've picked up one or more extra electrons. How do you wind up with a positive charge? You've lost one or more electrons. If you're an atom over here that's neutral, and you gain 3 electrons, we'll just say A for atom, you would be said to have a triple negative charge. Sometimes that's written with 3 negative signs. Let's say you're a neutral atom over here and you lose 2 electrons. 2 go away. You've lost them. That causes you to end up with a double positive charge. So that could be written like this, an A with a plus plus for an atom with a double positive charge. So you guys will see instances of those as you move through the class. And your other biology classes as well. All right, so an ionic bond, all that is, opposites attract. So if you have, if you've got an anion, why is my pen not writing? Come on. Oh, I've got it on eraser, that's why. All right, if you've got some anion over here with a negative charge and you got a cation over here with a positive charge, those two are attracted to each other and can form a bond, okay, which neutralizes those charges because the negative and the positive charges attract, opposites attract. So let's take a look at an actual example of this, a very common ionic compound. All right, so compound, remember how we said an atom is the smallest possible particle of an element. Molecules are the smallest possible units of a compound. For example, water, H2O. Water is actually a compound. So when you have a bowl of pure water, you've got a bowl full of H2O molecules. A single H2O molecule is the smallest possible subunit that's still water. Because if you take an H2O and you break it apart, what are you going to have? You're going to have a hydrogen, and an oxygen. Those are now no longer water when they've broken apart. You've got to have them bonded in a particular pattern in order to be water. So a molecule is the smallest possible unit of a compound. Ionic compounds are composed of ionic molecules, molecules that are built when ions bond with each other. And probably the most common example, the most famous example, is a compound called sodium chloride, which stands for NaCl, because Na is the symbol for sodium, Cl is the symbol for chlorine. You put them together and you have the compound sodium chloride. Guess what you guys know this as? This is table salt. Table salt is sodium, good old sodium chloride. All right, so how does this form? So if you look over here, sodium atoms are a type of atom that pretty easily give up one of their electrons. They have an electron that's orbiting pretty far out from the nucleus, and sodium loves to give that up pretty easily. And then chlorine atoms, which are neutral atoms, they're pretty good at picking up an extra electron. You know, an extra electron is very strongly attracted to chlorine. So since sodium loves to lose an electron, when it does that, it develops what kind of charge? If you lose a negative, you pick up a positive, you become a positively charged ion, a cation. Chlorine atom over here, when it gains that extra electron, it becomes a chloride ion that's negatively charged. All right, so now sodium has a positive charge, chloride ion over here has a negative charge. Those two are attracted to each other, and so now we have a compound called sodium chloride. And so when you're looking at salt crystals, what you're looking at are a bunch of these sodium and chloride ions that have bonded with each other to form that salt crystal. You're seeing gazillions of them that have bonded together to make that happen. Okay, and here's a picture from your textbook which is showing you what I just mentioned. When you see a salt crystal, a sodium chloride table salt crystal, if you looked in there, the sodium ions that are positively charged in this diagram are colored yellow. Your chloride ions that are negatively charged are colored in green. You can see that chloride ions are actually physically bigger than sodium, and they bond together. These positive and negative charges are attracted to each other, and they form a lattice work like this that makes a salt crystal. All right. Oh, and by the way, let me back up before I move on to this one. Back up over here for a second. Ionic compounds like sodium chloride are often called salts. So just because you see the term salt, that doesn't mean you're referring to sodium chloride. There are many other types of ionic compounds. For example, if you saw MgCl2, that stands for magnesium chloride. Magnesium likes to give up 2 electrons really easily, so it develops a double positive charge, and then you'll have, we said chlorine likes to pick up single electrons, remember that? So a single magnesium ion with a double positive charge will bond simultaneously to 2 chloride ions to make this type of salt, which is called magnesium chloride. Or you'll see things like calcium phosphate when we talk about the skeletal system. You have calcium ions, you have ions that are called phosphate ions. Those bond together and make a type of salt crystal. So you'll see there are many different examples of those. Sodium chloride is not the only type of salt that exists out there in the world. Go away. Hang on. All right. I guess that didn't. There's always something going on a computer when you're making a video. Probably my phone's going to ring next. Okay, so those are ionic bonds. Now what about covalent bonds? Most of the molecules that we'll talk about are formed through covalent bonds. All right, and so this is where you have 2 atoms that share electrons with each other. This is electron sharing. So we said with an ionic compound, one atom loses one or more electrons and another one gains them. And then so one develops a positive charge, the other one develops a negative charge, and they wind up sticking to each other. Covalent bonds are different. Neither atom really truly gives up or gains electrons. It winds up sharing. They share electrons with each other, and that helps bond them together or hold them together. This valence shell, I said we weren't going to really go into that. If you take a chemistry class, you will learn that electrons tend to orbit the nucleus of the atom that they surround in different levels or different layers. Those are called the shells or electron orbitals. The valence shell is kind of the outermost one of the atom, and that's where electrons tend to be lost or gained. So that's what that's meant. And also atoms like to have these shells. There are certain numbers of electrons that are supposed to be in each shell or level, and they like to have those either completely full or completely empty. And so when you take a chemistry class, you learn that that's what really governs how atoms bond with each other. But that's beyond the scope of this class. We're not going to, you can certainly read more about that in your textbook if you want to refresh your memory on some of those topics. All right, so here's an example of a molecule that is built through covalent bonding, sharing of electrons. So you got a carbon atom over here, and carbon atoms love to share 4 electrons with other atoms. And so carbon, for example, can bond with 4 hydrogen atoms, and that forms a compound called methane. Methane gas is CH4. So that means you got a carbon atom and 4 hydrogens surrounding it. And the hydrogens, each hydrogen is sharing an electron pair. 2 electrons orbit hydrogen and then also spend part of their time orbiting carbon. Okay, same deal over here. This hydrogen atom, there are 2 electrons that spend part of their time circling around hydrogen and spend part of their time orbiting carbon. Same thing with this one. 2 electrons orbit around hydrogen part of the time, and then they're over here orbiting around the carbon part of the time. That is covalent bonding. Different atoms tend to form different numbers of covalent bonds with other atoms. That's part of one of their chemical properties that they have. And we're not going to get into a lot of the details on that. Just know that when you hear about covalent bonding, this is what's going on. You have atoms that are sharing electrons with each other, and that helps bond them together. That holds them together. Now that can be represented on a diagram like what we were just taking a look at. More typically, though, what you see representing covalently bonded atoms, you see little diagrams that look like this, look like little stick figures. You'll see that pretty frequently. And all that means when you see that is you've got a carbon there in the center, and it is covalently bonded to 4 hydrogen atoms. Sometimes you might see, well, I think I've got some examples a little bit further down the road. I don't need to draw it. Yeah, like right here. Sometimes atoms, and again, this depends on their chemical properties, and we're not going to get into those details, but some atoms will share more than one pair of electrons with each other. For example, good old oxygen atoms. Oxygen in the atmosphere, like the oxygen that we breathe in that we need to survive, does not exist in the atmosphere typically as single oxygen atoms. Instead, it exists as a molecule of oxygen gas. This is called O2. And if you look at a lot of times you'll see O2 written out this way, where you've got an oxygen atom, and 2 lines. Those 2 lines tell you there's a double covalent bond there. So instead of just sharing one pair of electrons, you've got two pairs of electrons, and they spend part of their time orbiting this oxygen atom, and they spend part of their time orbiting that oxygen atom. That's called a double covalent bond, and that helps hold those oxygen atoms together. And again, that gets into this concept that atoms like their outermost shell, where electrons spend their time, to be either completely filled or completely empty. And so that's what really dictates how they, the numbers of electron pairs that they wind up sharing with other atoms. All right, and then that third type of bonding that I mentioned, hydrogen bonding, when we talk about DNA toward the end of this Chapter 2 section on basic chemistry, I'll point out hydrogen bonding to you. We'll just kind of bypass that for now. Next video lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about chemical reactions and what that means, because a lot of times we're going to see, as far as your bodily functions and how it operates, it really boils down to lots of chemical reactions that take place, chemical reactions that build larger molecules and break those larger molecules into smaller parts. So we'll talk a little bit about the different types of chemical reactions that take place out there in the universe and also in our own bodies. That'll be the third lecture for Chapter 2.